The winter of 1944 fell upon the Eastern Front like a cruel sentence. The wind that blew across the Ukrainian plains was biting, laden with snow and ice, and seemed to pierce the soldiers' uniforms like invisible blades. Everywhere, the landscape was scarred by war. Burned villages, roads littered with debris, and fields transformed into makeshift cemeteries. The German army was no longer the same as it had been a few years earlier. After the crushing defeats suffered in 1943, especially after the disaster of the Battle of Stalingrad and the offensive failure at the Battle of Kursk, the initiative in the war had completely changed hands. Now it was the Red Army that was advancing, pushing the Germans westward with a brutal and seemingly inexhaustible force. On the frozen roads of Ukraine, columns of German soldiers marched slowly backward, their faces etched with fatigue and hunger. Trucks bogged down in the frozen mud, horses pulled heavy artillery, their breaths turning into clouds of vapor in the frigid air. Many men could no longer feel their toes inside their snow-hardened boots. But what made the situation even more dangerous was the way the German lines were positioned. In the central sector of the front, near the small town of Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi, two large Wehrmacht formations remained too far forward into enemy territory. They formed a protrusion on the map, a section of the German line that projected dangerously into Soviet positions. At first glance, it looked like just another defensive position, but for the Soviet commanders, that protrusion was a perfect opportunity. For the German soldiers stationed there, the danger was not yet entirely clear. They occupied frozen trenches, makeshift observation posts, and small, destroyed villages. Some tried to keep warm around weak fires, burning pieces of wood torn from abandoned houses. But while they battled the cold and exhaustion, something gigantic was forming beyond the white horizon. Far beyond the German lines, thousands of Red Army soldiers were silently concentrating. Tanks were being gathered in snow-covered forests. Artillery batteries were being carefully positioned. Trucks brought in ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements non-stop. It was the kind of preparation that preceded a storm. And when that storm finally arrived, those men near Korsun would discover too late that they were in the most dangerous place on the entire war front. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to enter one of the bloodiest sieges of all of World War II, the terrible Korsun's Cauldron. The Soviet planned to create a giant trap, while German soldiers near Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi battled the brutal cold, believing they were merely defending another stretch of the long front. Something far greater was being prepared on the other side of the lines. It wasn't just another local attack. It was a coldly planned operation, executed with patience and a single objective: to completely destroy those German forces. From the end of 1943, after the decisive victories of the Red Army in Ukraine, Soviet commanders knew that the Wehrmacht was increasingly stretched, trying to defend vast territories with tired and dwindling troops. The German lines were full of dangerous salients, points where troops advanced too far into enemy territory. And, for an experienced strategist, these salients were invitations to an encirclement. Soviet generals had already learned a brutal lesson from the war. Encircling the enemy was far more devastating than simply pushing them back. This tactic had been used successfully in several recent offensives and, above all, had destroyed an entire army in the famous Battle of Stalingrad. Now, they wanted to repeat something similar, not exactly on the same scale, but with the same psychological and military effect. The idea was simple on paper, but extremely complex to execute. Two enormous Soviet forces would attack simultaneously, coming from opposite directions. One would advance from the north, the other from the south, like two blades of scissors slowly closing. The objective was not only to break through the German lines, but to advance deep behind them until the two ends met. When that happened, the entire group of German troops in that salient would be trapped, and there would be quite a few of them. Within that area were tens of thousands of German soldiers with artillery, tanks, and vehicles. A large combat group that, if surrounded, could quickly turn into a deadly trap. For days and nights, Soviet preparations grew silently. Frozen roads began to clog with endless columns of military trucks. Heavy tanks were transported to hidden positions behind forests and hills. Entire artillery regiments were put into position, their guns pointed at the German lines. It was a concentration of gigantic force. Soviet soldiers dug positions in the frozen ground, preparing attack points. Officers studied maps in dim light. Inside makeshift shelters, messengers ran from unit to unit carrying detailed orders. Everything had to happen at the exact moment. The element of surprise was essential. If the Germans realized what was happening too early, they could withdraw their troops from the salient and avoid encirclement. Therefore, the Soviets moved with extreme caution, often at night, hiding their tanks under trees and covering vehicles with snow-covered camouflage nets. But even with all this care, some German soldiers began to notice strange signs. Patrols reported hearing distant engines at night. Observers on the front line saw unusual movements in the white landscape. Sometimes, distant flashes on the horizon revealed Soviet artillery exercises. Still, no one imagined the true scale of what was about to happen. Because beyond the Soviet front lines, something impressive was being assembled. Thousands upon thousands of men prepared to advance together. Entire infantry divisions, tank brigades, ready to break through defenses. Rocket batteries capable of unleashing firestorms upon any enemy position. It was the kind of preparation that transformed an ordinary attack into an overwhelming offensive. And when the order was finally given, 2 waves of humans and armored vehicles would begin to advance simultaneously. If everything went according to plan, they would meet right in the heart of the German positions. And at that moment, the soldiers who were fighting near Korsun would realize that they were not just defending a front line, they were inside a gigantic trap that was about to close. The Red Storm begins. In the early hours of a freezing January morning in 1944, the heavy silence of the Ukrainian plains was brutally broken. For days, snow had been slowly falling on trenches, destroyed fields, and abandoned villages. The wind blew steadily across the white landscape, and the German soldiers in positions near Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi believed that this would be just another cold dawn on the long and exhausting Eastern Front. But then suddenly, the sky exploded. Without warning, thousands of Red Army cannons opened fire simultaneously. The roar of the artillery was so violent it seemed to tear through the very air. In seconds, the entire horizon began to flicker with flashes of fire and smoke. The frozen ground trembled beneath the soldiers' feet. Artillery shells began to rain down on the German lines like a hail of iron. The first explosions destroyed trenches, pulverized makeshift shelters, and hurled earth, ice, and pieces of wood into the air. Shrapnel flew in all directions, tearing through uniforms, flesh, and metal. Men who were waking up at that moment barely had time to understand what was happening. The bombing was devastating. Soviet heavy cannons fired incessantly. Between shots, the deep sound of artillery was accompanied by a new terror, the terrifying whistle of Katyusha rockets launched from trucks hidden behind Soviet lines. As these rockets streaked across the sky, they produced a high-pitched, frightening sound, as if the wind itself was screaming. And when they hit the ground, the destruction was instantaneous. Trenches crumbled, trees exploded into pieces, German vehicles were overturned or destroyed. The frozen ground was split open by deep craters. Soldiers threw themselves to the ground trying to protect themselves, pressing their bodies against the bottom of the trenches as the world around them seemed to be collapsing. Some men shouted orders, others simply clung to their helmets and prayed. The bombing lasted for long minutes that seemed like hours, and then, as the roar of the artillery began to fade, another sound emerged on the horizon. Engines, first distant, then ever higher. From the Soviet lines, the first dark silhouettes began to emerge, advancing slowly through the snow. They were Red Army tanks, moving in formation, crushing the ice and frozen mud beneath their heavy tracks. Behind them came waves of Soviet infantry, advancing with rifles in hand, protected by the advancing armor. It was the beginning of the ground attack. The German soldiers who had survived the bombing began to rush to their combat positions. Machine guns were hastily assembled. Teams of anti-tank guns searched for targets amidst the smoke and snow kicked up by the explosions. When the first Soviet tanks approached, the German guns finally responded. Anti-tank guns fired with violent roars. Some projectiles struck Soviet armored vehicles, piercing their sides and causing them to explode in flames. Tanks that were hit came to a sudden stop, with fire escaping from the turrets, while their crews tried to escape or died trapped inside the burning machines. But for every tank destroyed, others kept advancing. Soviet infantry followed closely behind, advancing through the smoke and debris. Soldiers rushed from crater to crater, opening fire on German positions. Soviet machine guns began firing, and the battlefield quickly turned into a chaotic mess of gunfire, explosions and screams. The white snow quickly began to be stained black and red. At various points along the German line, the defenses began to be pressed with overwhelming force. The German units fought with experience and discipline, but the number of attackers seemed endless. It was like trying to stop a flood with your bare hands. And that attack wasn't just happening at one isolated point along the front. To the north and south of the German salient, two enormous offensives were advancing simultaneously, like two giant jaws slowly closing. The German soldiers in the trenches didn't know it yet, but that storm of steel and fire was just the beginning. The real trap was beginning to close in. The German lines are starting to break down. After the initial impact of the artillery storm and the brutal advance of the first Soviet waves, the battlefield around Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi was already plunged into absolute chaos. Smoke from the explosions hung over the snow, forming a dark haze that mixed the smell of gunpowder, burnt fuel, and newly destroyed earth. The silence of winter had been replaced by a constant noise of gunfire, engines, and screams. In the German trenches, the Wehrmacht soldiers fought with everything they had. Many were veterans hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front. They knew exactly what to do when a Soviet attack began. Hold their position, use every machine gun, every grenade, every anti-tank weapon until the very last moment. In several sectors, the Germans reacted fiercely. MG machine guns opened continuous fire against waves of Red Army infantry. Quick, precise bursts cut through the icy air as Soviet soldiers fell in the snow during the advance. Anti-tank guns fired repeatedly at approaching armored vehicles, trying to stop the avalanche of steel before it was too late. Some Soviet tanks were hit and burst into flames. Others were immobilized with their tracks, destroyed. At certain points along the front, German resistance seemed to be holding back the attack. But the Soviet pressure was enormous. Behind the initial waves of attack, new units kept arriving. More infantry, more tanks, more artillery. It was as if the enemy would never end. With each passing hour, the situation began to worsen. The German lines were not only being attacked from the front. At various points, Soviet units began to find small gaps between the defensive positions. Taking advantage of the terrain, ravines and small snow-covered forests, groups of Soviet soldiers infiltrated the flanks. These leaks were dangerous. When one of these units managed to break through the main line of defense, it would begin attacking from behind or from the sides, creating confusion among the defenders. Command posts were taken by surprise. Communication lines were cut. Messengers disappeared in the snow. German coordination was beginning to fail. Radios crackled with urgent messages. Officers shouted orders, attempting to reorganize positions. Small counterattacks were launched to recapture lost trenches or expel the Soviets from destroyed villages. In some places, hand-to-hand combat began. Inside ruined houses, burned-out barns, and broken trenches, soldiers fought just feet apart. Grenades were thrown into shelters. Bayonets and rifle butts were used when ammunition ran out. The snow around those positions quickly turned dark with blood. Despite fierce resistance, Soviet Numbers began to make the difference. The Red Army commanders knew exactly where to apply pressure. They concentrated tanks and infantry on the weakest points of the German line, forcing ever-widening breaches. And when one of these breaches finally occurred, Soviet tanks would advance rapidly through the gap. These armored vehicles weren't interested in destroying every German position in their path. Their objective was different: to penetrate deep behind enemy lines. The further they advanced, the more dangerous the situation became for the German forces positioned in the salient. Inside German command posts, the maps began to show something alarming. Reports from isolated units were arriving late. Some divisions were already being pushed back in a disorganized manner. Others were beginning to lose contact with their neighbors on the front line. It was the kind of situation every commander dreaded, because when the lines begin to break, the enemy no longer needs to attack only from the front. He begins to infiltrate, surround and cut off escape routes, and at that moment, that's exactly what was starting to happen. The two major Soviet offensives, one advancing from the north and the other from the south, were progressing slowly but steadily. Every kilometer gained brought these two forces closer together, like two giant blades closing in on the map. There was still hope among the Germans that the line could be stabilized. Perhaps reinforcements would arrive. Perhaps a counterattack could be organized. But for many soldiers fighting on that snow-covered field, the feeling was already different. They were beginning to realize that this battle was not just another difficult defense. Something far worse was brewing around them, and the lines that were supposed to protect them were beginning to give way. The net is closing in. In the days following the initial attacks, the battle in the Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi region turned into a brutal race against time. For the German Wehrmacht soldiers, the priority was to hold their positions and prevent Soviet forces from advancing further. For the Red Army, the objective was the exact opposite: to advance as quickly as possible, penetrate deeply through the breaches opened, and complete the movement that had been planned for weeks. Soviet attacks did not diminish. On the contrary, they became even more aggressive. Tanks continued advancing across the ice-covered roads, escorted by columns of infantry moving swiftly. Between craters and frozen forests, Soviet artillery continued firing relentlessly, crushing German defensive positions before new waves of attack advanced. With each passing day, the German reports became more worrying. Units that should have been protecting the flanks were being pushed back. Small villages that served as defensive points were falling one after another. Important roads were being cut off by Soviet tanks that were rapidly advancing through the gaps. The map of the front was beginning to change in a frightening way. North of the German salient, Soviet forces had managed to break deep through the defensive line. In the south, another large group of armies advanced with the same brutal speed. The two ends of the offensive were drawing ever closer. Inside the German command posts, officers watched the maps with growing tension. Red lines representing Soviet advances were beginning to curve dangerously inward toward the German position. It was exactly the type of movement that indicated a siege. Urgent messages began circulating among the German divisions positioned within the salient. Some commanders suggested an immediate retreat to avoid the worst. Others believed it was still possible to stabilize the front with local counterattacks. But time was running out. While the Germans debated their options, the Soviets continued their relentless advance. Their armored units moved swiftly along secondary roads and frozen fields, bypassing many isolated positions to reach deeper objectives. The strategy was clear. They didn't just want to push the Germans back, they wanted to close the door behind them. And then, finally, the decisive moment arrived. After days of continuous advance, the two large Soviet forces, one advancing from the north and the other from the south, finally came close enough to complete their planned movement. At some point between the broken German lines, Soviet armored units coming from opposite directions met. When that happened, the battle map changed completely. The German troops' retreat route was cut off. In a single strategic move, some 60,000 German soldiers were trapped inside a huge area surrounded by Red Army forces. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, field hospitals, and supply depots, everything was trapped within that pocket. The trap had closed. German soldiers scattered throughout the destroyed villages, frozen forests, and defensive positions of the region began to receive the news that no combatant wanted to hear. They were surrounded. The roads leading west to the main German lines were now under Soviet control. In many places, enemy tanks already blocked the routes. Soviet infantry dug out new defensive positions around the perimeter of the encirclement. It was as if a huge, invisible wall had been erected around them. Within this perimeter, the situation quickly began to change. German units attempted to reorganize their positions, forming a new defensive ring facing outwards. Officers tried to maintain order among troops who were beginning to realize the magnitude of the danger, because a siege on the Eastern Front meant something very specific. Without supplies, without escape routes, and surrounded by a numerically superior enemy, each day inside that pocket would make survival more difficult. And as the snow continued to fall slowly across the devastated fields of Ukraine, 60,000 German soldiers began to realize that they were trapped inside a gigantic steel trap. What would follow would transform that place into a true winter hell. The birth of the Korsun Cauldron. When news of the encirclement finally spread among the German units trapped in the Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi region, the shock was immediate. What until a few hours earlier had seemed merely a difficult battle had now transformed into something far more dangerous. The map of the war had changed brutally. Roads leading west were closed. Soviet tanks patrolled retreat routes. Red Army infantry were already digging new defensive positions around the perimeter. The Wehrmacht soldiers were officially surrounded. Within that vast area of snow-covered fields, destroyed villages and small frozen forests, some 60,000 men were now fighting not only against the enemy, but also against time. Among German officers, a word began to circulate rapidly through radios and command messages: Kessel. In German, the word means cauldron. It was the term used to describe a complete encirclement, when an army was trapped within a ring of enemy forces. For many veterans of the Eastern Front, that word carried a terrible weight. Everyone remembered what had happened to the German 6th Army at the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, once again, German troops were caught in a melting pot. Within the pocket were experienced combat units, including Wehrmacht divisions and Waffen-SS formations. There were infantry, artillery, some tanks, and armored vehicles. But despite still possessing combat power, the reality of the situation was clear to many commanders. They were isolated. Supply routes had been almost completely cut off. Trucks carrying fuel and ammunition could no longer get through. Military trains were too far away. Supply depots within the cordoned-off area began to be carefully counted. Every bullet now had value. Every liter of fuel needed to be preserved. Inside the destroyed villages that served as command points, officers constantly studied maps. New defensive lines began to be organized, forming an outward-facing ring. Instead of facing the enemy only head-on, the Germans now needed to defend all directions at once. It was an extremely dangerous situation. During the day, Soviet patrols tested the German defenses around the perimeter. Small attacks were launched to pressure weak points. Soviet artillery was already beginning to adjust its positions, occasionally firing on villages where the Germans were concentrated. During the night, the cold became another deadly enemy. Temperatures plummeted well below freezing. Winds whipped through the open trenches, carrying fine snow that slowly accumulated on equipment and weapons. Soldiers tried to keep warm in makeshift shelters or inside destroyed houses, burning any scrap wood they could find. But wood was scarce, and the fuel too. Many men slept sitting up, wrapped in blankets soaked with snow. Others spent hours awake at guard posts, watching the darkness of the frozen landscape, waiting for the next Soviet attack. The distant sound of enemy engines and vehicles could be heard almost every night. Outside the encirclement, the Red Army continued to tighten the siege. New divisions were being positioned around the surrounded area. Heavy artillery was brought in to bombard German positions. Tanks patrolled important roads, ensuring that no escape attempt would go unchallenged. With each passing day, the Soviet ring grew stronger. Inside the cauldron, the tension was rising. Some soldiers still believed that a major German counterattack would come to liberate them. Others remembered Stalingrad and knew that when a siege closed in on the Eastern Front, survival became uncertain. Nevertheless, German discipline remained firm. Trenches were reinforced, machine guns were repositioned. German artillery still responded when the Soviets attacked. Even surrounded, those soldiers continued fighting. But everyone knew one thing. If no help came from outside, that cauldron would slowly turn into a deadly trap. And the Russian winter was only beginning to show its true cruelty. Hitler forbids retreat. As the reality of the siege became impossible to ignore, the German commanders inside the so-called Korsun Cauldron, they began sending urgent messages to high command. The reports were clear and direct. Tens of thousands of soldiers were surrounded, Soviet lines were rapidly strengthening, and supply reserves wouldn't last forever. The situation demanded a quick decision. Inside the makeshift command posts scattered throughout the destroyed villages near Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi, German officers studied maps while radio operators tried to maintain contact with higher command. Each new message sent out of the encirclement carried the same request: authorization to retreat immediately before the encirclement became impossible to break. For many experienced officers, the military logic was simple. If the troops continued to move quickly, there was still a small chance of escape before the Soviet ring was fully fortified. An orderly retreat could save thousands of men, preserve equipment, and avert a greater catastrophe. But the final decisions weren't being made there on the battlefield. They were being taken far away at Adolf Hitler's headquarters. When the reports reached the German high command, the response was swift and uncompromising. There would be no withdrawal. Hitler firmly believed that positions should be held at all costs. For him, allowing troops to retreat meant losing territory and showing weakness. In his view, every defensive position should be transformed into a fortress that would resist to the last man if necessary. Thus, the order given to the surrounded troops was clear. They should have stayed where they were. According to the German High Command's plan, a large rescue operation would be organized outside the encirclement. Armored units would be assembled and launch a powerful counterattack to break through the Soviet lines and open a corridor to the trapped forces. Until that happened, the troops inside the pocket should resist at all costs. When this order reached the commanders on the battlefield, the reaction was mixed. Some officers accepted the decision as part of German military discipline. Orders were orders. Others, more experienced, immediately understood the terrible risk of that decision. They knew very well what could happen when a surrounded army was forced to remain stationary for too long. The memory of the Battle of Stalingrad was still fresh in the minds of many soldiers. Inside the pocket, the news spread quickly among the troops. There would be no immediate retreat. They were to hold their positions and wait for the German army to break through the encirclement from outside. But while that promise existed on paper, the reality on the ground was much harsher. The Soviet attacks continued. Enemy artillery regularly fired on villages where the Germans were concentrated. Soviet patrols pressed against the defensive lines, searching for weak points in the perimeter. At the same time, the cold continued to punish the men trapped inside the siege. The nights were especially difficult. The freezing wind swept through the open trenches. Many soldiers slept in makeshift shelters made of broken wood and frozen earth. Others stayed awake for hours at observation posts, staring into the white darkness of winter. Food was starting to be rationed. The ammunition was distributed. Carefully, and each passing day raised the same silent question among men. When would the rescue come? Outside, beyond the Soviet ring, the German command was truly beginning to gather forces to try and liberate the pocket. Armored divisions were being mobilized. Tanks and vehicles were being prepared for a counterattack, but these operations would take time, and inside the Korsun Cauldron, time was precisely what the German soldiers had less and less of. Winter becomes a deadly enemy. As the days passed within the siege near Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi, a new threat began to show its strength, a threat that used neither tanks, nor artillery, nor machine guns. It was winter itself. Temperatures in the region plummeted deep below zero. During the night, the cold seemed to intensify even further, as if the frozen earth itself were sucking the heat from human bodies. The wind cut across the soldiers' faces like tiny, invisible blades, entering through the sleeves of their uniforms, their boots, and the torn holes in their coats that had already endured years of war. Within the pocket controlled by the Wehrmacht, the struggle for survival was becoming as difficult as the combat itself. The trenches were frozen. Digging new positions was brutal work, because the ground had turned into a hard layer of earth and ice. Often soldiers needed to use pickaxes or explosives to break holes in the ground before they could even dig out a defensive position. Makeshift shelters were built with pieces of wood salvaged from destroyed houses, broken doors, and beams from burned barns. But these shelters were rarely sufficient to protect against the extreme cold. During the night, many soldiers huddled inside these small, snow-covered holes, trying to conserve what little heat their bodies still produced. Some men woke up trembling violently. Others simply wouldn't wake up anymore. Frostbite began to become a constant threat. Fingers and toes would go numb inside soaked gloves and boots. When blood stopped circulating properly, the skin would slowly darken, a terrible sign that the tissue was dying. Field doctors improvised hospitals inside destroyed basements or small abandoned huts. These places quickly filled with wounded and soldiers suffering from hypothermia, but there were few medicines, few blankets, and almost no heating. The doctors worked with dim flashlights, trying to save men who arrived with gunshot wounds, shrapnel wounds, or simply frozen by the cold. Meanwhile, the Red Army's attacks continued to press against the perimeter. Soviet artillery regularly fired on German-occupied villages. Grenades exploded among destroyed houses, sending snow and broken wood flying through the air. Sometimes Soviet infantry attacks would quickly advance to German lines before being repelled by machine guns and rifles. Each attack cost lives on both sides, but within that pocket, each loss was even harder to replace. Food supplies were also beginning to dwindle rapidly. The captured supplies within the besieged area were being distributed with extreme care. Soldiers received increasingly smaller portions of stale bread, canned meat, or thin soup. Often the food froze before it was even consumed. Water was also a problem. To get a drink, soldiers often had to melt snow over small makeshift stoves, using whatever fuel was available. Meanwhile, the horses used for transport and artillery began to die of hunger or exhaustion. Some were slaughtered to serve as food for the troops. Within the siege, the war began to take on an even more brutal character. Each day was a constant struggle against the cold, against hunger, and against the enemy pressing in from all sides. But perhaps the worst part of all was the waiting. The soldiers knew that a German rescue operation was being prepared. They knew that tanks and armored divisions would try to break through the encirclement from outside, but nobody knew when that would happen. And as the men waited in the frozen trenches, gazing at the snow-covered white horizon, a silent question lingered among them. If the rescue took too long, how many would still be alive when it finally arrived? The Soviet attack tightens the noose. While the cold punished the men trapped inside the Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi pocket, the Red Army command knew that time was on their side. An encircled army did not need to be destroyed immediately. It was enough to press it slowly, crushing its positions little by little until its forces were exhausted, and that's exactly what started to happen. After closing the encirclement, the Soviets began a new phase of the battle, gradually reducing the pocket. Instead of disorganized attacks, they began conducting coordinated offensives, using heavy artillery, tanks, and infantry to crush specific sectors of the German line. Each day, the Soviet ring grew tighter. Soviet artillery began bombarding the interior of the pocket with increasing frequency. Batteries of cannons fired. Dozens of salvos at German-occupied villages, turning destroyed houses into mountains of rubble. Katyusha rockets cut through the sky with their terrifying howls before falling in violent explosions that shook the frozen earth. Within the Wehrmacht positions, the soldiers were already very familiar with that sound. When the rockets began to fall, many threw themselves to the bottom of the trenches or against the walls of makeshift basements. Even so, the destruction was constant. Metal fragments flew in all directions, tearing through sandbags, crashing through walls, and hitting men who had no time to react. After the bombing raids came the infantry. Soviet units advanced in groups, moving between craters and snow-covered tree lines. Machine guns began firing as the soldiers advanced, attempting to close the gap on German positions. In some areas, Soviet tanks accompanied the attack. The large steel machines slowly emerged from the smoke, crushing fences, abandoned carriages, and frozen pieces of wood. Their cannons fired at houses used as German defensive positions, destroying entire walls with a single shot. For the German soldiers inside the pocket, each attack was a desperate struggle. MG machine guns were still defending the trenches with quick and precise bursts. Grenades were thrown against the attackers. Anti-tank guns fired at Soviet armored vehicles that came too close. Often, the Germans were able to repel the attacks, but each defense was costly. Men were being killed or wounded. Ammunition was being used up, vehicles were being destroyed, and most importantly, the defensive line was slowly beginning to retreat. The pocket was shrinking. Villages that had once served as German command centers were being abandoned or destroyed. Inland roads were becoming dangerous, constantly bombarded by Soviet artillery. With each kilometer lost, the German troops were pushed into an ever smaller area. Within that confined space, chaos began to grow. Units mingled. Columns of wounded tried to reach makeshift hospitals. Wrecked vehicles blocked roads. Dead horses lay frozen in the snow beside broken carts. The sky wasn't offering much help either. German aircraft occasionally attempted to drop supplies into the pocket, but weather conditions and heavy Soviet anti-aircraft fire made these operations extremely difficult. Many cargoes fell into Soviet-controlled territory or were simply lost in the snow. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders continued bringing in more troops to the siege. New divisions were positioned around the pocket. Additional tanks reinforced the outer ring. Artillery increased its presence. It was constant pressure. Inside the cauldron, the German soldiers were beginning to perceive something more and more clearly. If the promised rescue didn't arrive soon, the Red Army would end up crushing the pocket completely. And in that brutal winter on the Eastern Front, time was running out for them. The German race to save the pocket. While the encircled soldiers held out inside the pocket near Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi, the German command outside the encirclement faced an urgent decision. If those 60,000 troops were abandoned, the result could be another disaster, similar to what had happened at the Battle of Stalingrad. This was not just a military matter, it was also a matter of morale for the entire German army on the Eastern Front. Thus, a rescue operation began to take shape. Armored units were quickly assembled at different points around the Soviet encirclement. Tank divisions, motorized infantry and artillery were moved across the frozen roads of Ukraine. The objective was clear: to launch a powerful counterattack against the ring formed by the Red Army and open a corridor to the surrounded troops. But organizing this offensive was not simple. The Eastern Front was already under enormous pressure. Many German armies were fighting to hold other parts of the line against the Soviet advance. This meant that forces available for rescue needed to be assembled quickly, often drawn from other sectors of the front. Even so, some of the Wehrmacht's most experienced armored units began to focus on the mission. The preparations were intense. Tanks were being refueled with the little fuel available. Mechanics worked tirelessly in makeshift workshops, trying to keep damaged vehicles running. Armored vehicle crews checked ammunition and equipment while receiving detailed orders for the offensive. Among these vehicles were the famous German tanks that had already dominated many battlefields in the early years of the war. When the offensive finally began, armored columns advanced along roads covered in ice and frozen mud. Engines roared across the white landscape as tanks slowly made their way toward the Soviet lines. It soon became clear that the task would be extremely difficult. The Red Army had anticipated a rescue attempt. Its commanders knew that a surrounded army always tries to be freed by external forces. Therefore, they had prepared several defensive lines around the pocket. Minefields had been laid along important roads. Soviet artillery was positioned to intercept any armored advance. Infantry units and anti-tank guns were ready to engage German tanks. When the German rescue forces began to attack, the fighting became fierce. German tanks advanced, firing their cannons at Soviet positions. Projectiles pierced frozen fields and struck trenches, destroying weapons and scattering enemy soldiers. German infantry advanced close behind the armored vehicles, attempting to clear Soviet positions one by one. But the Soviets responded with full force. Anti-tank guns began firing at the approaching German armored vehicles. Some tanks were hit directly, exploding in flames or becoming immobilized with their tracks destroyed. Soviet artillery also went into action, launching barrages of fire on the German columns attempting to advance. The battlefield quickly turned into a scene of destruction. Burning tanks billowed black smoke across the snow. Wrecked vehicles blocked roads. Soldiers from both sides fought amidst craters and debris, while the sound of explosions echoed across the horizon. Despite the losses, the Germans continued to advance. They knew that every kilometer gained brought them closer to the troops trapped inside the pocket. At times, the advance seemed promising. Armored units managed to break through some Soviet lines and advance deeper into the pocket. Inside the encirclement, the German soldiers began to hear rumors about this offensive. Some reports indicated that rescue forces were fighting fiercely to reach them. On quiet nights, some men swore they heard the distant sound of heavy cannons coming from the west. These rumors rekindled a small flame of hope. Perhaps rescue really was on its way. Perhaps the German armored divisions could open a corridor through the Soviet lines. But the path to the encirclement was still full of obstacles, and the Red Army had no intention of allowing that siege to be broken easily. The battle for survival of the 60,000 men inside the Korsun Cauldron was far from over. The pocket becomes a killing field. As the days passed, the situation within the pocket around Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi began to deteriorate rapidly. The space controlled by the Wehrmacht troops was getting smaller and smaller, while the constant pressure from the Red Army increased relentlessly. What had once been a relatively organized defensive line was now beginning to transform into a scene of chaos, destruction, and suffering. The net was closing in. Soviet artillery continued to hammer the interior of the pocket daily. Entire villages that still served as command centers or rest areas were repeatedly hit. Houses already destroyed crumbled even further under new explosions, turning into piles of broken wood, scattered bricks, and snow mixed with dirt and blood. The sky was often covered by a layer of grey smoke. During the day, it was difficult to find a safe place. At night, the freezing cold continued to rob the men of their strength. The makeshift field hospitals were completely full. The wounded arrived constantly. Some carried on makeshift stretchers made from doors torn from houses. Others supported on the shoulders of exhausted companions. Doctors worked tirelessly in dimly lit rooms, trying to treat serious injuries with minimal resources. Many soldiers had shrapnel embedded in their bodies. Others had lost fingers or hands to frostbite. Some arrived nearly unconscious, victims of extreme exhaustion. In many cases, doctors simply couldn't do much. Without sufficient medication, adequate anesthesia, and proper surgical equipment, many operations were performed quickly and brutally. Men screamed in pain as doctors tried to save their lives with makeshift tools. Outside the hospitals, the situation was also becoming increasingly desperate. Food supplies were almost depleted. The soldiers received minimal food rations, often just a small piece of frozen bread or a thin soup made from leftover provisions. Some men began hunting any animal they could find in the vicinity. Others helped slaughter weakened horses to use their meat for food. But even that wasn't enough for everyone. Hunger began to weaken the men. The soldiers' faces grew thinner and paler. Exhaustion was visible in every movement. Many were fighting not only the enemy, but also the physical burnout caused by weeks of combat, cold, and insufficient food. Meanwhile, the fighting continued. Soviet units regularly attacked German positions, attempting to further reduce the size of the pocket. In some places, fighting occurred at extremely short distances. Soldiers fought amidst destroyed houses, broken fences, and craters opened by artillery. Machine guns were firing non-stop. Grenades were exploding inside trenches. At certain times, the fighting would escalate to hand-to-hand combat. Soldiers fought with bayonets, rifle butts, and even knives when ammunition ran out. The snow around these positions was often marked by dark patches that slowly spread across the white winter sky. The pocket now looked less like a defensive position and more like a survival camp. Wrecked vehicles were scattered across the frozen roads. Broken wagons, dead horses, and abandoned equipment formed obstacles everywhere. In some places, dead soldiers lay partially covered by snow, frozen exactly where they had fallen. Within the siege, many men were beginning to understand a difficult truth. Even if the rescue team was trying to reach them, they might not arrive in time. And while the Red Army continued to slowly tighten the siege, the Korsun Cauldron was transforming into something no soldier wanted to face, a place where each day meant less hope and more death. The final order: break or die inside the pocket near Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi. The reality, finally, became impossible to deny. For weeks, the Wehrmacht soldiers had endured the cold, hunger, and constant attacks from the Red Army, hoping that German forces from outside would break through the encirclement and rescue them. But time was running out. The reports arriving at the command posts inside the pocket were increasingly worrying. The German armored divisions attempting to advance on the outside were facing strong Soviet resistance. Although they had managed to advance a few kilometers, they were still too far away to open a safe corridor. Meanwhile, inside the siege, the situation worsened each day. Ammunition reserves were dwindling rapidly. Many soldiers were now carrying only a few rifle magazines and some grenades. The German artillery within the pocket was firing less and less, simply because the projectiles were running out. The food had practically disappeared. Some units were surviving on meager rations, sharing small pieces of frozen bread or weak soup among several. Men. The cold continued to punish everyone mercilessly, and many soldiers were already too weak to fight much longer. Faced with this situation, the German commanders inside the pocket began to discuss an extreme measure. If they continued waiting for rescue, they risked being completely crushed by Soviet forces, but if they tried to break through the encirclement on their own, they would face a nearly impossible task, crossing heavily defended Soviet lines in the dead of winter under constant fire. Even so, the conclusion began to become clear. The only chance of survival would be to try to escape. Finally, the order was carried out. The troops inside the pocket should prepare for a mass break-up attempt. All units still capable of fighting would be gathered into a large column and advance together towards the nearest German lines. It was a risky decision, perhaps a desperate one. The plan was simple in theory, but extremely dangerous in practice. During the night, taking advantage of the darkness and snow-covered terrain, German troops would attempt to break through the Soviet ring at a single point, concentrating all their forces in a brutal advance. If they managed to break through the Soviet line, they could reach the German rescue forces that were still fighting outside, but if they failed, the result would be a massacre. Inside the pocket, preparations began immediately. Scattered units began to reorganize. Soldiers who had spent days defending isolated villages were now receiving orders to abandon positions and regroup at concentration points. Light artillery and vehicles that were still functional were prepared to accompany the advance. The wounded, who were still able to walk, were gathered with the columns, but many others had to be left behind. In the makeshift hospitals, doctors and nurses faced terrible decisions. Some soldiers were too injured to move, others were unconscious or unable to walk due to frostbite. There wasn't room for everyone in the escape. In heavy silence, many of these men understood what it meant. They would stay there. Meanwhile, the soldiers who were still able to fight prepared their weapons for the attempted breakout. Rifles were cleaned, machine guns were checked, grenades were distributed among the men. Some soldiers would quickly write short letters to their families in case they didn't survive. Others simply sat in silence, watching the snow slowly fall over the ruins of war. When night finally fell, thousands of German soldiers began to move in the darkness. Columns of tired, hungry and frozen men advanced slowly across the white landscape. Damaged tanks, makeshift vehicles and carts pulled by surviving horses tried to keep up with the march. Ahead of them was the Soviet ring. Behind them lay the Cauldron of Korsun, a place that had already consumed thousands of lives. Now there was only one choice left: breakthrough or die trying. The night of the desperate escape, when darkness finally enveloped the frozen fields surrounding Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi, the moment thousands of German soldiers had both feared and anticipated had arrived. The order to break the siege was underway. In the icy silence of the night, long columns of men began to move slowly through the deep snow. Wehrmacht soldiers advanced in tight groups, trying to maintain some semblance of organization as they marched through the dark, war-torn landscape. There were no screams, there were no lights, only the muffled sound of boots sinking into the snow and the occasional creaking of frozen equipment. Most of those men were exhausted. Many hadn't slept properly for days. Some were wounded, walking with the support of their companions. Others carried heavy weapons or pulled small makeshift sleds with leftover ammunition and supplies. A few vehicles were still functional: damaged trucks, armored cars, and some tanks that had survived weeks of combat. These vehicles advanced slowly behind the mass of soldiers, trying to keep pace with the march, but nobody knew exactly what they would find ahead. The plan was to advance towards the nearest German lines, where rescue forces were still fighting to break through the Soviet encirclement. If they could cross the enemy ring at that point, they might be able to reach the relative safety of the German lines. But there was a big problem. The Red Army already suspected that an escape attempt might happen. Soviet forces had fortified several positions around the pocket. Observation posts were scattered along the encirclement line. Patrols roamed suspicious areas. Artillery was prepared to respond quickly to any enemy movement. And at some point that night, the silence was broken. A Soviet patrol spotted movement in the darkness. Within seconds, signal flares were fired into the sky. Bright lights exploded above the battlefield, illuminating the snow with a ghostly glow. Suddenly, the German columns became visible, and at that moment, all hell broke loose. Soviet machine guns opened fire immediately. Bursts of bullets ripped through the darkness, hitting the first ranks of soldiers advancing through the snow. Men began to fall as panic spread through the column. Soon after, the artillery went into action. Grenades began exploding among groups of soldiers attempting to advance. Explosions kicked up clouds of snow and frozen earth as shrapnel tore through uniforms and equipment. But even under that devastating fire, many German soldiers continued advancing. They knew that stopping meant certain death. Officers shouted orders, trying to maintain formation. German machine guns began returning Soviet fire. Grenades were thrown at enemy positions as small groups attempted to fight their way through Soviet lines. The fighting quickly descended into absolute chaos. Soldiers ran between craters and trenches, trying to find cover. Some managed to cross small sections of the Soviet line. Others were trapped under heavy fire, trying to advance inch by inch. Soviet tanks began to move in the darkness, their engines roaring as they searched for the German columns attempting to escape. Their cannons fired at groups of soldiers and vehicles trying to break through the encirclement. In some places, the fighting came down to hand-to-hand combat. Soldiers fought just meters apart, using bayonets, grenades, and any weapon available. In the midst of the chaos, many men simply became lost in the darkness, separated from their units. The white snow soon began to be stained red again. The escape attempt was in full swing, but the price was terrible. Even so, thousands of soldiers continued advancing in the darkness, driven by a single hope: that somewhere beyond that Soviet wall of fire, there was still a path to survival, the hell of the frozen river. While the desperate escape attempt continued in the freezing night, thousands of German soldiers advanced through the deep snow trying to break through the Red Army's encirclement. The Wehrmacht columns were no longer the organized formations they had been at the start of the march. Now they were confused masses of exhausted, wounded, and desperate men, simply trying to keep moving forward. The battlefield had descended into utter chaos. Explosions lit up the horizon. Machine guns continued firing. Soviet signal rockets soared into the sky, casting a pale light over the white landscape and revealing scenes of pure despair. But the worst was yet to come. During the attempted escape, many of the German columns were forced to advance towards frozen valleys and rivers that cut through that region near Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi. These waterways, covered by a thin layer of ice and snow, became dangerous obstacles in the darkness. Among them was the Gnilyi Tikich River. In that brutal winter, the river seemed frozen enough to cross, but the reality was far more dangerous. As hundreds of soldiers began descending the slopes and attempting to cross the riverbed, the situation quickly became chaotic. Men carrying heavy equipment slipped on the snow and ice. Some tried to run to escape the enemy fire that continued to rain down on them, and then the ice began to break. In several places, the frozen surface could not support the weight of the columns of soldiers and vehicles. Large cracks suddenly opened up, and sheets of ice began to sink into the dark, freezing water. Men were falling into the river. The icy water was deadly. Soldiers who fell into the river desperately tried to get out, clinging to the edges of broken ice. Many were carrying heavy backpacks, weapons and ammunition, which made swimming nearly impossible. Some managed to crawl out, but many others simply disappeared into the dark water, swept away by the cold current or unable to move their bodies, already frozen by winter. Meanwhile, the Soviet fire continued. Machine guns fired at groups of soldiers attempting to cross the valley. Artillery shells exploded around the river, sending chunks of ice and snow flying through the air. Soviet tanks positioned on higher ground fired at any movement they detected. The situation turned into a real nightmare. Soldiers shouted orders, pleaded for help, or called out for missing comrades. Horses pulling carts panicked under enemy fire. Some animals fell into the river along with the men who tried to cross. Damaged vehicles blocked parts of the crossing, creating even more confusion among the convoys trying to escape. Even so, many continued to move forward, because going back was not an option. Behind them lay the pocket of defense that was being slowly crushed by the Red Army. Ahead of them was their only hope of survival. amid the chaos, and many were swallowed by the icy river water. The leak from Korsun's Cauldron was costing a terrible price. When dawn finally began to illuminate the devastated fields around Korsun-Shevchenkivskyi, the scene that unfolded before the survivors was something many would never forget. The white snow of the previous night was now marked by deep tracks of fleeing men, craters opened by artillery, and dark patches scattered across the battlefield. The attempt to break through the siege had come at a devastating price. For hours, thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers had advanced through the darkness, facing machine guns, artillery, Soviet tanks, and the brutal winter cold. Many had fallen along the way, shot down, wounded, or simply unable to continue after weeks of hunger and exhaustion. But some managed to get through. Small groups of survivors began to emerge from the other side of the Soviet lines. Advancing slowly through the snow, almost exhausted. Many were wounded, others had lost their helmets, backpacks, or weapons. When they finally found the German positions outside the encirclement, many soldiers collapsed in the snow, unable to take another step. Those who still had the energy helped carry the wounded, while officers tried to reorganize the survivors. German rescue forces had managed to advance far enough to allow some of the troops to escape the pocket, but the cost had been terrible. Of the approximately 60,000 men who had been trapped within the Soviet encirclement, thousands died during fighting, bombardments, or attempts to escape. Many others were captured by Red Army forces when the pocket finally collapsed. On the battlefield, the destruction was immense. Destroyed tanks still smoldered on the snow. Abandoned vehicles were scattered across the frozen roads. Dead horses lay beside broken wagons. Abandoned weapons and equipment were partially covered by the snow that continued to fall slowly. For the Soviet soldiers who advanced into what had previously been the pocket, the scene was equally brutal. They found villages completely destroyed, trenches filled with frozen bodies, and military equipment scattered everywhere. The entire field looked like a gigantic snow-covered cemetery. The battle that would become known as the Korsun's Cauldron was over. For the Red Army, that victory represented another major step in the slow destruction of German forces on the Eastern Front. The encirclement demonstrated once again the Soviet capacity to use massive maneuvers to trap and crush large enemy formations. For the Wehrmacht, however, the battle was yet another clear sign that the war was rapidly turning against Germany. Although some troops had managed to escape, the German army had lost thousands of experienced men, as well as a large amount of equipment and vehicles. Each of these losses made it more difficult to continue resisting the Soviet advance. And while the survivors from the pocket were being taken to the rear to receive treatment or reorganization, a reality was becoming increasingly evident to everyone involved. The tide of war on the Eastern Front had turned irreversibly, and the Korsun Cauldron would forever remain a brutal symbol of how that war, in that winter of 1944, was consuming men, machines, and hopes on a gigantic scale.